This is going to be the last video in this lecture series, and it is going to cover a controversial topic among non-scientists, but not among scientists, and that is human origins. I frequently have students that start this class with some trepidations about the topic of evolution, and by the end of it I think I've successfully given some individuals a little bit greater understanding and acceptance of evolution as a scientific discipline and the evidence behind how evolution has worked to create the biodiversity that we see around us. Some students, however, when they get to this point, they say, this is where I just can't buy it. And that's something that you're going to have to deal with. That's something you're going to have to deal with yourself. But just realize, if you've been rational this whole time, but you can't accept this, after this lecture you're going to see, it's just a summary, but the amount of evidence that we have to show our place in the animal kingdom within the great apes is staggering, the amount of evidence that we have. So if you can't accept that, you need to admit to yourself you're not being rational. Okay, and so that's an important thing for you to consider. So with that, let's get into it. One of the things that always surprises me is when I hear people say something like, well, there are humans and then there are animals. And I've just never understood that, because if you have any biological training at all, you know that there are the basic kingdoms: fungi, bacteria, plants, animals. So where do humans fit if we don't belong in the metazoan or the kingdom Animalia? And once you point that out to people, oftentimes they're okay with that. But when you take it to the next step, that's when you get problems. Because humans belong to the clade that are the great ape. And there is a great deal of evidence, both molecular, morphological, and even behavioral, that agree on this placement. Now, within the group of our closest relatives, until recently there was some debate on those branching patterns. So it could have been that humans are showing a sister species relationship with the two species of chimpanzee, or it could be a situation where we're really the outgroup to the other great apes, or we could have a sister relationship with gorillas. And I guess a fourth possibility is that all of these major lineages split at about the same time, which is relatively unlikely. Well, both molecular and morphological data have now reached a very good, clean consensus on the fact that the two chimp species represent a sister clade to humans. And if you look at some of the morphological synapomorphies for this clade, it includes similarities in tooth, skull, and limb shape, the fact that individuals in all these lineages show similar delayed sexual maturation, females show prominent labia minora, and males show a prominent pendulous scrotum. And again, recently we find that there's even more molecular support for this branching pattern. The common ancestor of this clade likely had the following behavioral characteristics as well. Probably knuckle walking, kind of the first step into bipedal locomotion. And a lot of the remaining characteristics are associated with being a habitat generalist, with a generalist diet, eating quite a bit of fruit, flexible behavior, cultural transmission, living in small social groups, and the use of tools and coordinated hunting skills. So these would all be associated with a common ancestor to the chimps and the human-like lineages. This clade probably split off from the remaining great apes about 6 million years ago, between 6 and 7 million years ago. This is associated with data from molecular clock estimates, looking at the mutation rate and the evolutionary rate of different molecules to estimate times of divergence. But also, if you look at the earliest hominin fossils, hominins are the human-like lineages. The earliest known hominin lineage was Sahelanthropus, which emerged right after the split with the common ancestor of human and chimps. And the sediment associated with these fossils give it a date of approximately 6 to 7 million years old. A little bit later, we see really good evidence of the evolution of bipedal locomotion, both in the fossils that are found in the orientation of the hip bones and the articulation of the femur and other aspects of the axial skeleton for an upright posture, but also we have these trace fossils. Trace fossils are impressions left in sediments, such as you could have an impression of a leaf, but here we're talking about footprints. And here we have really what I think is one of the most tragic sets of fossils ever. This is clearly two hominins walking bipedally through what was volcanic ash. So this was likely after a volcanic eruption. This is probably the last steps of these individuals. It was probably not a very good story. It always reminds me of a book. If you ever want to read a really good book that is also incredibly depressing, Cormac McCarthy, his book, The Road, is incredible. But again, make sure you're in a nice, warm, brightly lit place and not prone to depression, because it can be a very depressing book. So Sahelanthropus was possibly the earliest hominin lineage, and from there we see the evolution of the gracile Australopithecines. You may have heard of the fossil Lucy. Lucy was Australopithecus afarensis. The Australopithecines were called gracile because they had relatively small brain cases. They had these very strongly projecting faces. They did show bipediality, but they were very small. That's where the gracile comes from. They were very diminutive hominins, ranging from about 1 to 1.5 meters tall. The two hominin lineages that are derived from within the Australopithecines included the megadont hominins. These are very large, robust skulls, large, powerful jaws and teeth with prominent sagittal ridges for the attachment of massive muscles. These likely ate a lot of fibrous vegetation and needed these powerful jaws and teeth for that. The remaining clade represents the species in the genus Homo. The various species of humans in the genus Homo evolved about 1.8 to 2 million years ago. They're characterized by having larger brains, flatter faces with smaller teeth and jaws, much taller with relatively longer legs, so proportionally longer legs, and the degree of sexual dimorphism was reduced compared to earlier lineages. So there are multiple species in the genus Homo, but modern humans are Homo sapiens. So our species is Homo sapiens, and we are the only surviving human lineage. And there are several hypotheses existing concerning how Homo sapiens originated in Africa and then spread throughout the rest of the world. First is what we call the African replacement hypothesis. And the idea here is that there were earlier species that left Africa and had established populations in other parts of the world, including Neanderthals, Homo erectus. Then there were Homo sapiens that evolved in Africa, left Africa to spread throughout the rest of the world, and they basically replaced all of these earlier lineages. The hybridization and assimilation hypothesis, kind of the Leakey model, is very similar with the same basic idea, except you add on to it that there was some hybridization of Homo sapiens that have newly invaded these areas out of Africa with the previous species, such as Neanderthals and Homo erectus. And the last hypothesis that's been proposed is that Homo sapiens really are not a monophyletic group, but they have evolved independently in different regions of the world from previously established Homo erectus populations. And current genetic and morphological data support that modern humans did originate in Africa about 170,000 years ago. So think about that. We've been talking about millions of years or hundreds of millions of years in our examples throughout this semester. Now we're talking about our species leaving Africa only 170,000 years ago. And this is based upon molecular clock data looking at mitochondrial DNA sequences. Genetic data also show evidence of hybridization between Homo sapiens, modern humans, and these earlier established Homo lineages in Eurasia. So in some cases, we see the Denisovian population had about 4.8% of their genome hybridizing with Homo sapiens, and Neanderthals had a little less, about 2.5% of the genome. So this does support that intermediate hypothesis associated with an early establishment of earlier lineages with then an out-of-Africa invasion by Homo sapiens with hybridization of these earlier lineages. Now, we used to think that humans were really special with regard to tool use, but biologists have been documenting that other animals do use simple tools. Chimps will actually use stems to pull out termite larvae from nests. They'll use crushed up leaves as sponges to gather water in holes that they can't get to, and they'll use rocks as hammers. There are lots of examples of birds using simple tools. The woodpecker finch of the Galapagos Islands uses cactus spines to spear larvae that it can't access with its beak. And if you want to know more examples of tool use in birds, take my ornithology class, because I'll teach you a lot about that. So we're not really that unique in using tools that are relatively simple, but we now think that only humans can make complex tools. I would almost beg to differ with that, with one example of the New Caledonian crows, which can craft very specific tools. So even this is being challenged. But clearly, we are capable, at least in modern society, of using much more complex tools than any other animal. The first human tools were anything but complex. They were simply modified rocks made by early hominins for crushing and scraping and cutting. And this occurred about 2.3 to 2.6 million years ago. And the taxa that are associated with these deposits are uncertain. But human morphology has co-evolved with tool use. So we have greater flexibility of moving your thumb around and touching with more delicate precision all of the other fingers, something that chimpanzees just simply can't do. And a lot of that has to do with increased musculature. We have muscles that chimpanzees simply don't have. We have these three muscles right here, if you compare the chimp thumb to the human thumb. So that increased dexterity in large part is due to these muscles. But also the bone structure is different. If you look at that metacarpal, this bone that was shown right here, which is associated with many of these new muscles, this bone shows a different height and width ratio. If you look at the metacarpal 1 length versus the metacarpal 1 head breadth, you see that Homo sapiens form a distinct cluster if you look at the variation within Homo sapiens compared to the chimpanzees. So the chimpanzee, they lack certain muscles, but also their metacarpal bone is shaped quite differently. If you use this same set of data to estimate which past lineages likely use tools as well, we see that a very strong pattern. Those where we have evidence that they did use tools, they also had thumb morphology more similar to Homo sapiens. And those that lacked tool use, like Australopithecus afarensis, they show thumb morphology more similar to that shown in modern chimpanzee species, both the bonobos and the common chimpanzee. Well, what about language evolution? We really don't have too much direct evidence of language origins, because those are the types of things that can't directly fossilize. But we do know that human language development is innate. Even isolated communities of deaf children can develop their own sign language with standard vocabulary and grammar. And we know that there are 2 neurological circuits responsible for language in humans. And these do show some homology with structures seen in other primates. So for example, the neural pathways associated with sound recognition and control of muscles of the face, tongue, mouth, and larynx are shared across all of the great apes. They are simply not associated with vocalizations. So modifications of these areas of the brain for incorporation of speech are derived characteristics of an original adaptive neurological circuitry used for other functions. If you look at the larynx, our voice box, it has also been modified. First, it's descended in a lower position, which allows us to produce more complex vocalizations than just hooting and cries that you might hear in other primates. Also, the hyoid bone, which is embedded within the larynx, is very similar in Neanderthals as it is to modern humans, but very different from that of the chimpanzee. So this is likely the adaptive morphology associated with forming vocalizations, which suggests that the Neanderthals also had spoken language. Modifications of this will allow for different attachments of laryngeal muscles associated with forming vocalizations. Okay, that's it. I hope you've learned a little bit about evolution this semester, and these videos have helped, and the class discussions have helped as well. Hope to see some of you actually in person in future classes. Thanks. Bye.